Hey, welcome along. On today's show, it is an honour to have with us one of my favourite commentators on the scene. I've had the pleasure of sharing stages with him around the world: New York, London, Malibu, Copenhagen. He's written a brand new book, The Strange Death of Europe: Immigration, Identity, Islam. The author is Douglas Murray. Douglas, great to have you with us. A lot of us have dabbled in this terrain, and what I like about your book, though, is it winds up very profound and existential. There's really three elements to the book. You deal with the kind of prosaic, bureaucratic government aspects of immigration. You travel around Europe meeting some of these refugees at their ports of entry. And then you get to actually the big questions about whether Europe, Christendom, the birthplace of the modern world, is dying before our eyes. And it seems to me, just by way of introduction, that actually most Britons, most Europeans, they see the news, there's a terrorist attack here, there's something happens in Paris, something happens in Brussels. But the political class and even most European citizens do not even look at it in big picture terms.
No, I think that's exactly right. I was so fed up with writing about sort of bits of this question. When the migration crisis in 2015 really kicked off, I was writing pieces, going to the places in Greece and the islands of Italy and elsewhere and following the story up. And I just had this endless feeling that first of all, it needed to have the dots connected. And secondly, that I needed to write about what was really going on, which it seemed to me always was centrally about us. And what it was that we had got that had meant that we were doing what I think is a suicidal thing. And yes, I mean, it's strange in Europe these days, the way in which we get caught up on these, something happens, something blows up, and in a few hours, we go back to the usual routine. The next day, sort of, within a week, before the funerals are over, everyone's sort of moved on.
Right.
And I thought this needed to try to be explained.
Yeah. And you as you say, it's at a certain level, it's about us. So that even though Islam makes it into the subtitle of your book, it's not primarily about terrorism or even about Islam. Something deeper is going on in Europe, of which Islam and terrorism are really just symptoms.
Yes, I mean, it's something you've said for a long time, that as it were, this just happens to be the opportunistic thing that's most serious that's going on at the moment, but it sort of could have been anything in a way, anything that was assertive and believed in itself. I say in the book there, there's sort of set of what I think of as thought diseases that we have, guilt being one. Existential tiredness, which I explain at one point, is another. That sense that, you see, when trying to look at why politicians and others would totally change the society that they ought to be looking after, it can't only be accident.
No.
And it's certainly not conspiracy, because nobody could have arranged this so well.
Right.
And I thought it's in part this feeling that we run out, that the stories run out, that as I say at one point, a change is as good as the rest. Right,
which is... And people do actually believe it. You just to tell the story the way you tell it, you begin with a very nuts and bolts chapter on immigration, and you make the very basic point that all the most anti-immigrant figures in the 1960s, what has happened is on a scale beyond all their doomsday predictions, so that for British viewers and other European viewers and Commonwealth viewers will be familiar with the name of Enoch Powell, who was a prominent conservative, and gave a famous speech which became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. And you point out in the beginning of your book that if you look at the boroughs in London, which are now majority non-white British, that's beyond anything Powell predicted.
No, if Powell in 1968 had decided to say that in 2011 the official census would show people who identified as white Britons to be in a minority in their capital city.
Right.
I mean, that would have caused. We think that the speech caused enough trouble as it was. That really, that would have got him, confined, I'd have thought.
But people would have thought that he was just nuts, that there's no way that can happen that quickly.
Yes, and as we all know, all the worst doomsayers were underestimating the situation. I mean, the other one is or one of the others I give is the example in France of this, I think, a ugly novel, Camp of the Saints, which has 1 million people landing on the shores of France, coming from the third world. And there's this interview I quote in the book where in 2011 the author of that novel that was published in 1973 thought to be absolutely explosive and so on, he's interviewed about the fact that quite a lot of what he said seems to have sort of happened. And at the end of the interview in 2011 on French television, the interviewer says, "You've got to admit, Jean Raspail, you've got to admit, the numbers never happen like that." And he says, "No, that's true. We never actually had 1 million people come in one go. 2011.
Right.
Was. Even the most apocalyptic people.
And then Frau Merkel invites in whatever it is, 1.5 million to Germany. And you have and again, these are the major powers we're talking about here: Britain, France, Germany. But you just mentioned en passant at one point that the majority of Swedes alive now will live long enough to see them become a minority in their own country.
Yeah.
This is Sweden, which is kind of as far north as you can go in Europe. And it's also, it's interesting to me because with Britain, the 1948 British Nationality Act made a quarter of the world's population British subjects. They did not distinguish in law between one of His Majesty's subjects from Kingston-on-Thames, Kingston, Ontario, Kingston, Jamaica. You can argue about whether that's a good idea, but it is a legal fact. Sweden is not anybody's idea of a great global empire. How do Swedes wind up becoming a minority in their own country?
It's a very interesting case, a Swedish one. There were things that I kept on thinking may not apply to certain countries. I thought maybe, the Swedes have got no reason to have post-colonial guilt. There's a good argument for Britain having it for a bit, but the Swedes, and then and also then the other bits of the guilt, of course, which I think is one of the fundamental things in Europe that we're going to have to shake off, but may not. The Swedes don't seem like, they're not like the Germans, who have like good cause to have recent guilt complexes and so on, and forever, needing to apologise for what they think and feel and do. The Swedes, you wouldn't expect that. Actually, all of the same things exist. The Swedes do have a kind of weird post-colonial thing. They have a guilt thing as well. They've actually, strangely, the further away they come from the war, the more guilty they feel about it seems. Right. So it's just more quietly expressed, but they're all symptoms of the same thing. It's just ever so slightly different inflections in each country. Sometimes one country's facts are different, but the response is exactly the same.
Yeah, there's an interesting phenomenon that goes on in Europe. When I first started writing about this, I guess, shortly after 9/11, sophisticated people at think tanks and whatnot used to say, well, this is a completely banal reductio. Obviously, if you look at Pakistanis in Yorkshire, that's completely different from the experience of Algerians in Clichy-sous-Bois, or Turks in Hamburg, or and in fact, none of it is. It's like you could toss, the Turks could be in Yorkshire and the Pakistanis could be in Clichy-sous-Bois, and it all seems to come out the same.
Yes, that's one of the things that you've been on to longer than anyone. And what's so fascinating about it, isn't it, is that it's almost as if at any one time, the only thing worth talking about can't be talked about.
Right.
As you say, I mean, sort of endless sort of, I give an example in the book at one point of a discussion at the University of Heidelberg I was unfortunate to be a part of, and the realization of the horror of what thought was thought to be. Yeah. But it was just an extreme version of something that goes on all the time, which is at any think tank meeting, any public meeting, any political discussion, any television show most of the time, this one aside and a few others, but I mean, any BBC show, you never get into the only thing that matters. Yeah. It's you never get on to the important things. It's just time to sort of say, well, there's a huge difference, isn't there, Douglas, between these people and that people. Right. And you go, well, yeah, I mean, and then, well, thank you, and that's that. Right, you don't get the chance to say, what about this huge thing that's happening? And I think there are all sorts of reasons for that. One is that we console ourselves through this period by pretending it's not going on. But as I say at one point in the book, the presumption we've had is that the lie of more than a generation is if you walk into the Italian islands or the Greek islands or anywhere else, you walk up through Europe, you become as European as anyone else, and you breathe the air of Voltaire and St. Paul and Dante and Goethe and Bach. Right. And that's nonsense, isn't it? I mean, we know that, but it's profound nonsense. People come with their own ideas, and that was never discussed really. No. We only, again, I mean, if we sat in a BBC sort of studio, I think, well, they're as European as the next person, Mark. What are you saying? And you sort of have to say, well, I'm not saying they're not. But I think it's highly unlikely that everyone who arrives in Europe arrives at the same slightly pained, wounded and tired view that modern Europeans find themselves to be. I think it's highly unlikely they'll have just arrived and happened to be at the stage we're in our views of religion, for instance. No. Much more likely they'll bring their own views, and we're discovering that, aren't we?
Well, you describe at one point, you're in France, and you visit the famous cathedral in which Charles Martel's remains are interred, the man who held the line against Islam in 732 and is celebrated, and that's why he's buried among the French kings. That's his stature. And yet you describe the scene around that cathedral, which is really quite remarkable. Yes. Aside from that Christian building in the middle of it, it's not Europe anymore.
No, I mean, I say if Charles Martel got out of his tomb and wandered just outside the Basilica at Saint Denis, he would think he'd lost the Battle of Tours. Right. It's a very strange and painful thing, this. The French, I think, are deeply pained by this. They don't know what to do about it. The centre of Paris, they all know this place is there. Yeah. It's an extraordinary part of their history where the tombs of the kings all are. Yeah. But they don't want to go there. And they wish it wasn't there. They wish it wasn't as it was. But it is.
And you make it actually quite a subtle point about public transit in Paris. Where there's two categories of subway lines, as it were, and how it's possible to ride the upper subway line and still think you're in France, but that the lower line, which is the one the immigrants take across the city, is completely different.
It's the metro, where it's also chichi, centre of Paris, sort of thin and well dressed and everything like that, going off to their offices and so on. That's the sort of shallow line that stops quite regularly. But then there's the deeper line, the RAR, which goes out to the suburbs and goes out to the airport, and that stops much more occasionally and travels a far further distance, and it's like another world. And there are these places where the RAR line comes up in the centre of Paris, and they are the bits where sort of people sort of avoid, people from the suburbs come up and they go to the local McDonald's or whatever. these are, as you well know, I mean, these are two different things living alongside each other. But you do get these intimations sometimes of how this can go. And I think, as was tried in the book, say that this is, we're all thinking about this. I mean, everyone apart from our politicians, obviously, but we're all worrying about this. And it's a version of what I think I explained at one point that I think of as being the process we've been going through in Europe and that America and others have been going through, which is that sort of feeling that the boomers and others had that basically history in the future was a one-way street, when we were going to walk up it and the crowd was all with us, and if you walked faster you'd get more points, but we're basically walking to an ever better and brighter future in which we had more and more rights and fighting for more and more niche rights, but that was all. And then we noticed somebody walking down the other way. And sort of, well, that's odd. And then more people started walking the other way. And then it seems to me that we in Europe are in the process of wondering what if one day more people are walking the other way than are walking our way.
Right.
And that's what's happening.
Yeah, and it's you explain the background to this. We have a demographic issue, which is that Europeans do not want to have babies for whatever reason.
Can I say about this one? That one is one of the things I did in this book, looking at this, was looking at that question, and it's true. But we get onto that strange thing of why do people not ask why?
Right.
So, during the period immediately after Tony Blair massively expanded the migration into Britain after 1997, if you look at the public opinion polls, the social attitude surveys about the number of babies that women want, it is actually at the levels which, as you know, that would be a perfectly adequate replacement. Most women want more than one child, and some want 5, and most want about 2 or 3. So
very few people, if they want to have children, want to have an only child.
Yes, and actually, it was a very small number of people said I was not interested in the kids' business. So this argument, and I keep trying in the book to explain why the arguments we hear about why it happened then, why it happened in the 50s, why it happened now, why it happened in 2015, are all bogus arguments made up after the facts were put upon us anyway.
Right.
So if you had a worry about not having replacement babies of your population, you'd look at why women felt they couldn't have children. Why, and I say at one point in the book, so anecdotally, nobody in my country who knows a young couple hears them say, we're really after 5 children. Because they know that they've got with 2 really good salaries, they'll work very hard to be able to afford the first, work incredibly hard to treat themselves to a second, and a third is sort of out of, the only people who can afford to have more than 2 babies are basically the very rich or the very poor.
Right.
And but that's something you could address. It's like Angela Merkel's thing of we need to import like if you've got an aging population and a greying population, as the Germans would say they do, then surely there are things like raising retirement age, encouraging people to have more children. There's loads of things you do before deciding that the next generation of Germans should be from Eritrea.
Right.
Loads of stuff.
Well, and you look at it in practical terms. In your country, one of the reasons why people constrain the size of their families is because property prices are very high. So to have 3 children. If you want to live in Greater London,
you've got to be a multimillionaire.
And that's why rock stars like Mick Jagger are incredibly fecund, because they can afford individual bedrooms for all the children they sire. But if you're not in that situation, it's expensive and impractical. And as you say, governments that balk at kind of creating the conditions that would enable people to have space for a family, nevertheless think that somehow cultural transformation is easier to manage.
Yes. It's also that one that in Britain we need to basically build a city the size of Liverpool every couple of years to make up the migration that's coming in. about 300,000 houses, new houses a year need to be built. And almost nobody says that's actually net almost precisely the number of people who are coming in each year.
Right.
It never gets raised.
Right.
And of course, if you do raise it, it's like, oh God, you're banging on about it. Everything's about immigration, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're going on about immigration again. You go, well, actually, it does affect almost everything.
Yes,
it affects property prices. It affects people's views about the future of their country. It affects their views on culture and everything else. Yeah, I mean, it's quite a good thing to bang on about. I mean, we chose a good subject.
It's still a disreputable subject in a certain sense, isn't it? And you have people. I saw Kenneth Clarke, former Lord Chancellor, big heavyweight member of the Conservative Party. He was on Question Time with my old friend Conrad Black a few months ago, and I happened to see him. And he suddenly goes into this sentimental rhapsody about how the multicultural transformation of Britain has been one of the most wonderful things he's seen in his lifetime.
Right.
That he hardly ever, he says, I hardly ever saw a black person when I was growing up, and now I don't even notice it if I see one on the bus or something. Well, I don't believe that the Lord Chancellor takes buses that often.
And you wouldn't particularly expect him to say, oh, there's one.
Yeah,
no. It wouldn't.
But this seemed to me the most absurdly sentimental, that somehow you make the point in the book that we're supposed to celebrate diversity. And Britain is already like a big Stanley Gibbons album. It's got, initially it was the Empire.
Yeah.
Now you've got people from places that were never. Within Her Majesty's dominions in any sense. So it's like moved beyond that to all kinds of people. And you say, at what point are we, we're not diverse enough. If we add another 1 million Pakistanis, are we diverse enough, or is it going to be another 4 million Pakistanis?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, the problem with parts of East London is that they're not diverse enough, but they count as diverse. They're just there aren't the sort of people who tick white British in enough a number to make it a diverse place anymore. But does that count? Yeah,
because you're saying that diversity means now predominantly Muslim areas of the East End, where all the non-Muslims have found it uncomfortable and moved out.
Well, that's the thing, you see, because the Kenneth Clarke argument is, well, there are still these bits of the countryside, of course, where the sort of they haven't had diversity enough. Actually, that isn't true. A lot of the people who don't live in places like East End of London have moved out because they tried diversity and they didn't like it all that much. Or, they discovered that their area was entirely Bangladeshi and they just didn't, that wasn't what they thought their future was going to be like. And they move out to Kent. Yeah,
you have a great paragraph in the book, and just like an observation, which is fascinating. That, because it's about the difference between how we live our lives and the attitudes we hold. And you talk about Swedes in Stockholm who find Swedish cities are all becoming a bit too diverse and multicultural. So they move out to the country to live among more of their ethnic Swedes. But if asked by pollsters, they still say that, oh yes, we'd much prefer to live in a more diverse neighbourhood.
Yeah, the less diverse the area you move to, the more in favour you are of diversity for other people. But at the heart of this, it's one of these huge questions, which again we never asked ourselves. I mean, this is one of the things that fascinates me about this is just looking over the history of this, we never ever predicted any of it, and we never asked any of the serious questions. And one of the things that is most bizarre about this whole thing is, like, what was it about ourselves in Europe that we decided, Europe is a really boring, uncultured place that hasn't done enough or thought enough or created enough. And what we really need is an injection of people from around the world to bring us their brilliant culture. Now, the thing about this is, of course, is that we all know that who of us doesn't want to know about the world's cultures and find out things? But the blessing you get from it isn't constant. In relation to the numbers who arrive. So the first Afghan can introduce you to Afghan food,
Right.
but the 1,000th Afghan doesn't introduce you to more food than the first, and the 1,000,000th, and so on and so forth.
No.
So, but what is it about us that makes us think that there's this hole in our heart, that the culture that produced all of this in Europe, the culture that produced the Renaissance and the Reformation, and the heights of what we regard as civilization,
Right.
actually had a hole in its heart that needed filling? Because you never ever hear this about anywhere else. No one ever says.
No.
The thing about Somalia is they really need an input of people from Wales to go and introduce them to, you know.
It's really hard to find a good French restaurant in Mogadishu, and you know, the chamber orchestra really could use some. There's not enough bark in Somalia. Nobody ever says that.
It's never done that way round.
Yeah.
And this goes to the masochism that we clearly indulge in. That as I say in the book at one point, you know, I mean, we're in a great risk on this one. That, I mean, the great problem for masochists, so I'm told, is what happens when they meet a real sadist. And it's possible that we're in the process of meeting our sadist.
Yes.
And that what seemed to be just a sort of kink turns out to be fatal.
Yeah. In other words, you're in the bondage dungeon and you suddenly realise there is no safe word. To extend your metaphor.
My uncomfortable metaphor.
Yeah. What I find interesting, though, before getting too hung up in the bondage dungeon, is, you know, as I go about, I don't live there, so I go back to places, sometimes places I just knew as a child.
Right.
Oh, but there are places I go to, I'm in every 7, 8, 10, 15 years or whatever. And what's sad to me is that diversity actually makes everywhere boring. And that if you go to a small town, this is particularly true in Germany and Scandinavia, you go to a small town that you remember is actually quite a pleasant little Swedish town or Finnish town. And it's not that you're getting great Pushtun cuisine. It's that some immigrants have come there and they're running a pizza and kebab place,
Right.
which is like the ebony and ivory of fast food in Northern Europe. And it's not great pizza and it's not great kebab. It's just the drab, uniform face of this rather cheerless multiculturalism. And you travel around the continent. I mean, you can't honestly say it's enriching, can you?
Not after a certain point, no. No, I think the first bit is sort of interesting and enriching, and then the returns slow down.
Yeah.
And you also, of course, then start to get the problems. This is a fascinating. I was doing recently in London. It was a public discussion and a debate, and there was a really interesting moment when I saw a young, right-on PC German guy said, "You know, I'm very happy with what Angela Merkel did in 2015, and I think it'll make our country much more." Did all that stuff, and you know, and I said to him, I said, "Well, I mean, okay, you might get a slightly cheaper cleaner off this, maybe a slightly cheaper au pair if you have children, and you just got to hope that your kids don't like Ariana Grande and go on the wrong night."
Right.
And if you are willing to take that, if it was presented like that, I say slightly tongue-in-cheek at one point in the book that, I mean, the deal we seem to have come to on all this in Europe is that on the plus side, you know, or on the minus side, we've got a bit more gang rape and beheading than we used to have. But on the plus side, there's a much wider range of cuisine. So it's all swings and roundabouts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just got to choose, you know. Well, and that's if you'd have ever said to the public, I mean, if Merkel said it now, look, only a couple of people out of the first million will be suicide bombers. You know, and on the one side, you know, you get a wider range of languages heard in your local neighbourhood. And on the downside, you know, every now and then, if you're standing outside the wine bar in Ansbach, you'll get blown up. But you know, everything's a choice, you know.
Yeah. No. It's like you met these people at their ports of entry on the Mediterranean where they come in, and you're sweet and affable with them, and you wish them all good luck. The point isn't that some of them are suicide bombers and some of them are rapists, gang rapists, child rapists, whatever. The point is that all of them en masse eventually reach a point where they change Belgium or the Netherlands into a mere territorial designation.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. By the way, I mean, one of the reasons of going and speaking to people at the front line was I think that if you're going to draw conclusions, or let alone some suggestions, as I rouse myself to do by the end of the book, you know, you need to stare the whole issue in its human face, and that includes speaking to people who've been through the most terrible things, obviously. I mean, people who fled Afghanistan and so on have stories, some of which I relay in the book, which are unimaginable. But I suppose one of my overwhelming feelings is we've got to do that and recognise the scale and still find answers. Right. You know, one of my views these days is just that, in general, because of our politics and particularly the way that sort of millennials are persuaded to look at the world, everything is as if it's about, you know, I'm great, you're Hitler, I'm good, you're evil, you know, hear me roar. Right. And, or mew. Yes. And whine. But one of the things I say towards the end of this book is, actually, when it comes to something like this, it's about competing virtues. Yeah. Just as sometimes things are about choosing between evils. Right. And we've got caught in this competition between what I describe as justice and mercy, which, and we have the tools in our own tradition, our own traditions of rationalism and philosophy to deal with this. Aristotle looked at this. What happens when two things that seem to be virtues are in competition? Right. Well, you must be misunderstanding and misapplying one of them, and you've got to work out where that is. And one of the things I say on this is, in the search to be merciful, we've, among other things, given up the idea that there should be any justice for the peoples of Europe. Because we don't have another home. No. We are in the process of wrecking the only home we have by saying that absolutely anybody from anywhere in the world who wants to come into our home and make themselves at home is welcome. Yeah. And that is to my mind, the most wicked thing to do. And one of the reasons why is that you've totally screwed over future generations. Right. You've inherited something that you haven't passed on. Right. In fact, you decided to destroy the whole thing for your short-term emotional misunderstanding gains. Yeah. And I think that's unforgivable.
No, I think you're right that within the space of our current political class's tenure, they have offered up for sacrifice their great capital cities, London and Paris and Brussels and so on. So that if you look at a TV show from the 70s, that London and Paris and Brussels is gone and is unrecognizable. Why it happens, you made an interesting point to me once. You were talking about that in a sense we think we're stronger and more confident than we are. And you said it's like when the Prince of Wales goes to visit an Anglican church on a Sunday morning. And of course everyone hears that the Prince of Wales is coming to church service this Sunday. So the pews are packed, and he walks in and he thinks, I don't know what they're talking about. Church of England is in decline. Things seem to be humming along. And your sense is that that over evaluation of our own cultural strength is
yes. I think that sort of Merkel Blair generation of politicians also have a version of that. You know, they don't see what anyone who's younger than them can see, in particular, whether they like it or not. Which is that all these things are changing very fast, and that strong sort of assertive culture is not there. You know, where in our schools would students and pupils be taught to carry on this tradition? Mainly, they're told how to war on it. That's the new, has been for a generation.
Right.
That's the new way to be clever and virtuous.
Yeah.
So maybe they just won't pass it on this time.
No.
And I think, by the way, I mean, across America, you can see that. I mean, it seems obvious to me that students in America haven't been taught the American idea.
No.
I mean, they have. I mean, one of the things that, you know, both of us are obsessed by, free speech. I mean, they don't understand the idea.
No,
I mean, it's not just that they, you know, want to turn up and holler and jabber and sometimes knock people out and set light to cars if they say something that's mildly, you know, disagrees with their point of view. It's that they don't think that free speech matters, really.
No, and the funny thing about it is, if you're cut off from your cultural inheritance, as and I think that's true in Europe, in America, I think it's true in Canada. We're celebrating our 150th birthday. Very few Canadians actually could give you a coherent answer on the 150th birthday of what.
Right.
But the thing is, once you recognize that there's a hole in your somewhere inside you, you don't necessarily turn back to what you've lost. You have a book, a bit in the book that I recognized, and people who've encountered this particular kind of young lady recognize, where you say, you know, you've heard all these stories, they're all the same. Some girl who's of easy virtue, she's off her head, she's rat-assed in a nightclub somewhere, and at some point she wakes up, you know, face down in her own vomit and thinks, this is a meaningless, empty life, I need to turn my life around, and she finds Islam.
Yes. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, this. I've heard so many stories of this, and I've spoken to lots of people who've had versions of this. Tends to happen around the turn of your 30s. But these are the questions we need to ask ourselves. You see, the person who's brought up in a society where basically, you know, what are we doing? I mean, young people understand, what are we actually doing here? What's all this about? What's this for? Basically, the only thing you get is, well, you can buy new stuff that's kind of crappy and you'll have to replace it a bit later, and that's the point. And you can acquire things. You can go on holiday. But aside from that, what are we doing on this earth? What are we?
These are like the, you know, when everybody, when there's a bomb and David Cameron or Theresa May or whoever's next in line says, we will never surrender our... the bombers will never force us to change our British values, which means, like, as you say, buying the latest iPhone and listening to Ariana Grande.
Yeah, this is the consequence of something I say in the introduction to this book is what happens when you take in the world.
Right.
If you're going to import the world into your country, apart from the fact that if you import the world's people, you'll import the world's problems, which is something we've only just started to wake up to. The other thing is you've got to change who you are, because you've got all these people who have totally different views from each other and among each other and towards yourselves. So you've got to have a definition of yourself that encompasses the whole world. And that's why our politicians end up in this thing of saying, you know, you say, what are British values? Well, they're about tolerance. Well, that's all right. And being nice. Well, all right. You know, that sounds all right. And being decent and being diverse, of course.
Right.
I think that's necessarily wide because you're trying to encompass everyone you now have in your country. But it's shallow. It's totally shallow. Who says, God, I just can't wait to lead my tolerant, diverse life? It answers none of the questions which we as people, as human beings and as souls ask. And So we have this strange thing where the culture says nothing to you,
Right.
and it has no reason for what we're doing. I give the example at one point in the book of a wonderful French philosopher called Chantal del Sol, who has this terrific image of modern European, indeed Western man, as what she describes. She says we're like Icarus fallen. We're like Icarus would have been if he'd survived the fall. We in Europe try, in my explanation, we tried everything. We tried all the religious ideas, different interpretations of it. We tried all the political ideas. We dreamt these dreams in the 20th century, and they all collapsed, and it was all terrible. And we oughtn't to be here, and yet we are. And we are singed and bruised and looking up at the fall we just made, and we don't know what to do. And the only answer is the thing that most people do when all the ideas collapse, which is you have a nice time.
Right.
The problem is it just doesn't last very long because it can't sustain itself. There's nothing meaningful. And that, to your point about the convert thing, is that the Islam bit is so galvanizing and important and so worthy of our attention because it has a strong and assertive claim.
Right.
It makes, to my mind, ridiculous claims for itself and that are obviously wrong. But they're claims. They are claims about everything. And when people say in the West that they want to understand why people do it, you think you've got to start from the understanding that these people are talking about everything.
Yeah.
Life, death, love, meaning, absolutely everything. And you, in return, are saying, well, we're going to reevaluate this bit of our counter-terrorism strategy or our inclusivity strategy to really, really mend that bit. And if you think, our Home Secretary did this again recently, Amber Rudd, and I said somewhere that, in the end, you've got to realize that Amber Rudd might tell you something, but Allah might have a different view. Yeah. Who are you going to go with, Amber Rudd or Allah? Yeah. I reckon most people will notice that the Home Secretary will probably be replaced in a few months' time and so on. They may just plump with what they regard as being the answer to absolutely everything.
Well, you propose a couple of ways in which this might be turned around or this might go in the next few years. And you mentioned Michel Houellebecq's novel Submission, in which the protagonist makes an effort to come home to Christianity, and he can't do it.
Yes.
And you say, because, as you know, every village in Europe is centered around a church on a village green and all the rest of it, and you're not asking people to become necessarily believing Christians, but just to return to the cultural Christianity that was, the old joke about, when the Jehovah's Witness knock on your door, oh no, we're not religious here, mate, we're Church of England. That you know all the hymns, you recognize the biblical quotation, the things that were standard in Britain a generation ago. Yes. And on most of the continent, and we're along, even getting back to that.
Yes, I try to. I mean, some of the things I say in the book about slowing down the migration flow and all these things are sort of practical suggestions, but these are the ones. These ones are the ones that really matter.
The big existential things. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not asking people to be believing Christians. I'm not a believing Christian, but. One of the things I say is we are Christians anyway, whether we like it or not, and we're probably finding that out at the moment. I mean, where the hell do people think that human rights came from? Yeah, right. I mean, these are things that exist on the embers of Christian thought.
But you know as well as I do, Douglas, that there are a lot of people who say, well, I'm totally opposed to what Islam's doing, and then they say, I'm a secular rational atheist.
No, they're a secular, rational Christian atheist.
Right.
They may not want to be, but they are.
Yeah.
They still dream Christian dreams.
Yeah.
They still have Christian thoughts and impulses. Yeah. They don't actually behave as they would if they had no baggage at all. But this is this is one of the most important things, is what is our attitude towards this past? There's a passage in the book where I mention, what is our attitude to these buildings in our midst? Are they embarrassments? Are they something we think we return to in times of trouble? And one of the few things, this is, as it were, too deep to be picked up by the sort of average Guardian reviewer, who I was somewhat lambasted by, as if this was as if it was, this classic. There's a classic thing about the shallowness of our time, where whenever you mention anything important,
right,
it's like, oh, why are you going on about that for? It goes back to the thing about the migration. Why didn't you join us in talking about this boring by-election prediction?
Right. The sort of present tense hamster wheel is all that matters.
But this attitude, what our attitudes towards our past is, matters, and warring on it, I know, is not an answer. In fact, is part of our current catastrophe. Warring on our past includes the people who say, I'm really against suicide bombers, and that's why we've got to close faith schools.
Right.
Or they go, I will criticise the crazy jihadi, but I also don't want bishops in the House of Lords.
No.
And I mean, apart from being a total waste of your energies and time, it's also just obviously positioning. I'm just showing I'm really even-handed in this. It's also that Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, is one of the sort of central figures of this book in a way, because we should take seriously several of the very straightforward things he urged. And one of them was, he said, he at one point urged and persuaded the late Oriana Fallaci, who was an atheist, of this. He said to behave as though God exists. And he also made what I think of as being one of the key insights, because one of the reasons why people war on their origins in Europe is, apart from the positioning and all that sort of thing, is because they think that it's about the philosophy and the reason and the science or the religion.
Right.
And I say at one point in the book that we should recognize, for instance, I say, look, the churches have given up claims. Benedict did it himself in an encyclical. They've given up the claim to legislate. Okay, there are parts of the world where that's not the case, but in modern Europe, the churches basically have no legislative power and have, by their own admission, said they don't want it. So as long as they cannot impose their beliefs on a non-believer or someone who doesn't believe this, the argument about the position of religion to that extent in the moral sphere has been sorted out. But there's something that the non-religious then have to do, which is, and I think this is a quid pro quo, which is to concede that in matters like issues to do with life and meaning, the churches have a voice. They've thought about this. I mean, one of the great things I discover on campuses sometimes is people are like, oh, we don't want any X telling us about, we don't want that bishop telling us about, procreation.
Right.
I think, well, it's possible that the church has thought about these matters. I mean, it may have even thought about them more than you have in your 18 years of life or whatever. And there's a whole set of issues with that case. It's almost as if we've said, anything that comes from our religious and philosophical tradition, by its nature, is of no interest to us. Right. Because we've got this great new idea. And of course, sadly, the great new idea is this St. George in retirement, as the late Ken Minogue described it, syndrome, where the whole of life is a set of battles for rights, and you've slain the dragon, and now you stagger around the land looking for smaller and smaller dragons, till you're in the situation the left's in at the moment, where they're just standing, leering and waving a sword around at empty air.
Or the less relevance an issue has to people, the larger it looms. So that sexual identities no one had ever heard of till 20 minutes ago, like all the intersexual questioning and all those become suddenly the be-all. And then there is a terrible thing. I always thought you were much more optimistic than me a decade or so ago. And you used to say that you used to be more optimistic when you went to the Netherlands or whatever, that they could actually reverse and change this. One of the interesting phenomena of modern politics is the nanosecond between, oh, we've still got plenty of time to address this problem, and, oh, it's now too late to do anything about this problem. And I feel that in the a couple of years after 9/11, if you talked about the Islamization of Europe or whatever, people said, oh, we've still got plenty of time to address this problem. Implicit in the reaction of Theresa May and François Hollande and Angela Merkel and all the others now is that it's too late to do anything about it.
Well, it's certainly beyond any one politician or any one generation of politicians. And I've come to the view that I think you're right. I mean, I was probably more optimistic 10 years ago, but then events happen, don't they? And you see the same thing play out everywhere. And I mean, optimism and pessimism depend on the facts you see, and the facts are not great at the moment. Specifically, I think the thing that I find saddest is that it's hard to see decent ways out now. And that just fills me with worry. You know, we had 3 terror attacks in 10 weeks in the UK, and after each of them, the Westminster Bridge, the Manchester concert, and then London Bridge. And after each of them, the same disheartening and troubling thing happened, which is that everyone said, "Don't look back in anger. Love must overcome hate, and don't really look at why this might have happened. Stop it. Don't finger point." And then, just a couple of days ago, we had what looks like an attack by a non-Muslim on Muslims coming out of a church, using ISIS-style tactics of using a van to just mow innocent people down in the street. And of course, a different thing happened. Instead of love must overcome hate, don't point fingers, it was get your fist out and find the people who you know, actually, I mean, I don't want to jeopardize any future trial or anything, but it looks like the guy was just a lone madman who may have had the most horrible, and obviously did have the most horrible views. But there's my point is, what's so disheartening is that there is still so little desire or appetite to find out and deal with the problem when it is, you know, a 22-year-old of Libyan descent blowing people up on the way out of an Ariana Grande concert. But we still just know exactly what to do and focus everything when it's the crazy white, far right, whatever. Why don't we apply the same thing? Even now, why wouldn't we? And that to that extent, we sort of go around in just this boring, tiny learning curve circle. There was a BBC question time the week after the Manchester thing, and this guy in the audience said, look, the mosque that the bomber went to, I went there on an open day the other month, and they gave me this leaflet, and it's all about how awful the West is and how... And you know, this is an interesting point. We would think this is an interesting point. What show was it? No, everything was just like, shut the guy down. The presenter was like, well, we don't know that you picked it up there. And then there was a woman in a headscarf who said, I go to that mosque, and I don't believe that was given out. Anyway, you quoted it out of context. And and everyone was like, but out of context, wrong, didn't pick it up, total lies, boo to the... And this guy is like, left then, nobody says, but the presenter says, we don't know whether you got it at the concert. and he's just like, this bloke with his leaflet thinking, what the hell just happened? He's like, it's in my hand. Like I said, I read a piece after saying, welcome to the rest of us, mate. No one cares. No one cares about the interesting and important fact. They shut you down because they don't want it.
No, and it's what Hans Christian Andersen got wrong in the little boy who points out that the emperor has no clothes. Because when you point out that the multicultural emperor has no clothes, the mob just clubs the little boy to a pulp for disclosing that fact.
Yeah.
Just as a final question, Douglas, because you, as I say, you posit alternative endings in the book. And in a sense, the longer it goes on without something changing, the more it's, and it shouldn't be necessary point this out to anyone from the United Kingdom, because you have journeyed through this process all over the map in various little colonial skirmishes, and much closer to home in Ireland. The longer you go on, the worse the options get, until only violence remains. Can violence be avoided?
I just hope so. One of the points I make at the end of the book is that I think we have been losing the opportunity to have a soft landing on this, and that really worries me. I mean, things like this attack outside this mosque the other day are in some ways even worse and more disheartening, because you think, oh God, let it not be like that. You know, let it not be sides, you know, forming and revenge attacking each other. As you say, we saw that in Northern Ireland, and we've seen it in many other places. And I think we've been running out of time to make it an easier landing for ourselves. But, you know, this is all stuff that America, and we're all going through versions of this at different stages. So the best we can do, it seems to me, is be as well informed as possible, to have as wide a discussion as possible about it, to recognize and to speak fearlessly about what we think is coming or possible, in order to be able to weigh up our options decently. And I think there is still always hope. There is always hope that something changes, that people come along. I mean, I know people hate the sort of great men of history sort of version of history now. It's all got to be about class struggle and gay rights.
Yeah.
And,
but strong man on a horse.
But actually, in my view, I have a bit in the book about what I call the early warning sirens. I don't mention you in it, by the way, because you're not a European, but I would have, if I'd have gone beyond Europeans, you would have been one of the very earliest warning sirens on this, because you've been warning about this for a long time. But the point of those early warning signs is also this point, actually the people matter. You know, an Italian left-wing feminist there, a gay Dutch politician there. People matter. And in a way, one of the worst things about the kind of class struggle, socioeconomic view of history is it tells people you don't matter. It's all about something else beyond your control. But I think that isn't true. I think that people change history.
Right.
And maybe at some point soon there'll be more people, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, whatever skin color, whichever nation, who will help get us out of this.
No, and I would like, you mentioned, you know, Oriana Fallaci, who was a ferocious left-wing feminist. You mentioned Pim Fortuyn, who was a kind of gay hedonist Dutchman. What's interesting is that, as you say, none of these people are like right-wing hate. I mean, when I got into my little problems in Canada, I was a right-wing hater, so it was entirely reasonable for people to say, oh, he's no spokesman for free speech. Why couldn't we have had Margaret Atwood? Something? That's entirely reasonable. But what was interesting to me about Oriana Fallaci, the left-wing feminist firebrand, Pim Fortuyn, the gay hedonist Dutchman, is that within 10 minutes of embracing this issue, they suddenly became a right-wing hater just like me. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a black Somali immigrant. She gets cancelled at Brandeis at an American university because she's suddenly right-wing hater riddled with white privilege. You know?
Yes, that's these are all very bad signs, all of this. But again, I mean, maybe it's also the case that the public are with these people. Yeah. I mean, I one of the things that is most fascinating to me about this is this vast gap.
Right.
That's, you know, if you write for papers as you do and I do, you get to hear back from people. And the number of times there are questions which I, you know, probably overthink and furrow my brow, worry desperately morning, noon and night about. And it's, you know, it's a reader who it's a, oh no, we're not bothered about that.
No,
or, you know, oh no, that's fine. You know,
no.
We won't put up with that. You know, and so this, I mean, one of the things of recent months post Brexit has been noticing the way in which people on the continent are very distrusting of the people, actually.
Right.
But I do have a residual, even after our recent election in Britain, where Theresa May coshed herself over the head repeatedly, and the British public helped her. Even after that, and even after things like the rise of this lunatic Jeremy Corbyn to position, I do still have a faith in people's decency and honesty, and I don't think we are mobs waiting to break out, and I think we're reasonable and tolerant people who just don't like having the piss taken, really. And would rather it wasn't taken.
No,
if you wouldn't mind awfully.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind awfully. That's a very English and civilized way of putting it, to Douglas. You said something about speaking out fearlessly, and I should say, as you're the last person to play the victim card, but those of you who do speak out in London and the other capital cities of Europe, and I think you have a tougher road to hoe than those of us in Canada, Australia, America. And so speaking out fearlessly does come at a price, and you have paid that. And you and some of these other European figures have been brave and constant on this subject for many years now, and I hope that that doesn't change. The book is called The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam. Douglas Murray, thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure.
Thanks.